The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps, casting their harsh glare across the sterile briefing room at Edwards Air Force Base. It was 7:30 in the morning, and the air was thick with tension and the bitter aroma of military-grade coffee. Around the polished conference table sat 12 of the Air Force's finest test pilots. These were men who had stared down the sound barrier and lived to tell about it. Men who spoke in the clipped, confident language of those who had tamed machines that could kill them in a heartbeat. At the head of the table sat Colonel Marcus Viper Richardson, a legend in his own right. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who had spent 30 years pushing experimental aircraft to their absolute limits. Today, however, those lines seemed deeper, etched by frustration and mounting pressure from Washington. The project that had consumed the last 18 months of his life was hanging by a thread, and everyone in that room knew it. The X-47 Nighthawk program was supposed to be America's next great leap forward in aerial warfare, a hypersonic reconnaissance aircraft capable of Mach 6, designed to slip through enemy airspace like a ghost and return with intelligence that could change the course of conflicts before they even began. It was sleek, revolutionary, and absolutely beautiful. It was also completely unstable. "Gentleman," Colonel Richardson began, his voice cutting through the morning stillness like a blade. "We're here because the Nighthawk has a problem that's got the Pentagon breathing down our necks and the press asking uncomfortable questions." He gestured toward the massive screen at the front of the room, where technical diagrams and flight data scrolled in an endless parade of numbers and curves. 3 test flights, 3 near-catastrophic failures. The bird goes unstable the moment we push her past Mach 4.2, and none of our computer models can explain why. In the back corner of the room, almost invisible against the beige walls, a young woman in an unmarked utility uniform moved quietly between the coffee station and a small table stacked with technical manuals. She appeared to be maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and the kind of unremarkable appearance that allowed her to blend into the background of any military installation. To the assembled pilots, she was furniture, a coffee girl, someone whose job was to keep the caffeine flowing while the real work got done. Captain Jake "Hotshot" Morrison, the youngest pilot in the room and the one with the most to prove, leaned back in his chair with the casual arrogance that came from being told, "You were special since flight school." "Colonel, with all due respect, maybe we're overthinking this. I have been flying experimental birds for 5 years, and sometimes you just gotta feel your way through the problem. These computer jockeys keep trying to solve everything with math, when what we need is stick-on-Drudor skills." A few murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. These were pilots who trusted their instincts, who had learned to read the subtle language their aircraft spoke through vibrations in the stick and changes in engine tone. Mathematics was for engineers. Flying was an art. Continued her work, her movements economical and precise. She refilled the coffee pot, arranged the technical manuals with military efficiency. But if anyone had been watching closely, and no one was, they might have noticed the way her eyes tracked the data on the screen. They might have seen the almost imperceptible pause when Captain Morrison mentioned the Mach 4.2 threshold, or the slight tilt of her head when the flight engineer began explaining the engine specifications. The problem isn't pilot technique. The lead engineer, Dr. Sarah Chen, interjected from her position near the screen. Her voice carried the patient wariness of someone who had spent countless sleepless nights. "The fly-by-wire system isn't fighting the pilot, it's trying to save his life. Without computer assistance, the Nighthawk would tumble out of the sky like a brick." Captain Morrison's response was immediate and dismissive. "Ma'am, I don't mean any disrespect, but I've been flying birds that shouldn't fly since before you got out of college. Sometimes the computers are wrong, and sometimes you need a pilot who can think faster than a processor." The young woman by the coffee station finally looked up from her work. For just a moment, her eyes met those of Colonel Richardson, and something passed between them. It was brief, perhaps half a second, but in that instant, the colonel saw something that made him pause. He saw the look of someone who understood, someone who had seen this problem before, in a different context, in a different machine, but had seen it nonetheless. The briefing continued for another hour, with each pilot offering theories that ranged from reasonable to ridiculous. Some blamed the fuel mixture, others suspected sabotage. A few suggested that the whole program was cursed, that they were trying to push the envelope too far, too fast. But no one had a solution that would satisfy the generals in Washington or the engineers, who had staked their careers on making the impossible possible. As the meeting finally drew to a close, the pilots began filing out, their voices a mixture of frustration and bravado. They spoke of getting back to the flight line, of pushing their own birds harder, of proving that American pilots could overcome any challenge. But underneath the confident talk, there was an undercurrent of worry. They all knew that if the Nighthawk program failed, it wouldn't just be a professional setback, it would be a national security disaster. The young woman began clearing the coffee station with the same quiet efficiency she had shown all morning. She stacked the empty cups, wiped down the surfaces, and prepared to fade back into the invisible infrastructure of the base. But as she reached for the last coffee cup, Colonel Richardson's voice stopped her cold. "Airman," he said, his tone careful and measured. "A word, if you don't mind." The last few pilots in the room turned to watch, curious about why the colonel would want to speak with the coffee girl. Captain Morrison, still smarting from having his theories dismissed by the engineers, let out a barely audible snort. Even the cleaning staff was getting more attention than the actual pilots. The woman turned slowly, her face a mask of professional neutrality. She said nothing, simply stood at attention and waited. But Colonel Richardson was no longer looking. At her face, his eyes had found something else, something that made his own expression change from casual curiosity to sharp, focused attention. It was easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, a subdued black circle with silver wings and a single star. To most people, it would have meant nothing. It was just another military insignia in a world full of them. But Colonel Richardson knew exactly what he was looking at. He had seen that patch only twice before in his entire career, both times on people who officially didn't exist. It was the mark of the 42nd Test Squadron, a unit so classified that it's the ones that pushed the absolute bleeding edge of what was possible in the sky. The room had gone completely silent. Even Captain Morrison had stopped his posturing, sensing that something significant was happening, even if he didn't understand what. The young woman continued to stand at attention, but there was something different about her posture now. She wasn't trying to disappear anymore. She was simply waiting. Colonel Richardson felt his pulse quicken as the implications began to sink in. For the past hour, they had been throwing theories and speculation at an impossible problem, while someone who might actually have the answer had been standing quietly in the corner, fetching coffee and organizing manuals. The irony was so profound, it was almost painful. "What's your name, Airman?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would be more complicated than a simple response. "Captain Alina Santos, sir," she replied, her voice steady and clear. For 2 ND Test Squadron on temporary assignment to logistics support. The silence that followed was the sound of a dozen assumptions crashing to the ground. Simultaneously, Captain Morrison's face went through several shades of pale before settling on a sickly green. The other pilots exchanged glances that ranged from embarrassment to outright shock. And she was not only a pilot, but a captain with more flight hours than half of them combined. But it was more than just her rank that had Colonel Richardson's full attention. It was that patch, that impossible, legendary patch. The 42nd Test Squadron was whispered about in the darkest corners of the aviation community. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was where the Air Force sent their most talented and most expendable pilots to test aircraft that pushed the very boundaries of physics. These were machines that existed in the space between breakthrough and catastrophe. Aircraft so advanced and so dangerous that their test flights were conducted in complete secrecy, often at night, always alone. Captain Santos, Colonel Richardson said, his voice now carrying a weight of respect that had been absent moments before. "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. Have you encountered this type of hypersonic instability before?" Captain Santos stepped forward, her demeanor shifting subtly but unmistakably. The invisible woman was gone, replaced by someone whose very presence seemed to change the atmosphere of the room. "Yes, sir, 3 times. The Aurora project in 2019, the Blackbird Mark 7 in 2021, and most recently with the classified Wraith program last year." Dr. Chen, the lead engineer, leaned forward, her scientific curiosity overriding her surprise. "The Wraith program. That's impossible. There is no Wraith program. I would know about any hypersonic research project of that magnitude. Captain Santos looked at Colonel Richardson, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Dr. Chen, the Wraith program officially doesn't exist. What I can tell you is that it's a Mach 8 capable reconnaissance platform that suffered from identical instability issues to what you're seeing with the Nighthawk. The same cascade failure at the same aerodynamic threshold. The room erupted in whispers. Mach 8. The number hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about the limits of atmospheric flight. Even the most advanced public projects barely scraped Mach 5. And here was this quiet woman casually mentioning aircraft that moved through the sky at speeds that seemed impossible. How, Captain Morrison managed to ask, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance, how do you solve something like that? Captain Santos moved to the whiteboard, where Dr. Chen's unsuccessful calculations still covered most of the surface. She picked up a red marker, uncapped it with a precise motion, and began to draw. But this wasn't the frantic scrawling of someone trying to work out a problem in real time. This was the confident stroke of someone who had solved this puzzle before, multiple times, under conditions far more demanding than a comfortable briefing room. The issue isn't with the aerodynamics, she began, her voice taking on the measured cadence of a teacher explaining a complex concept to students. Everyone assumes it's about airflow separation or control surface effectiveness at hypersonic speeds. But the real problem is harmonic resonance. She drew a series of wave patterns on the board, each one building on the last. At Mach 4.2, the Nighthawk's airframe begins to vibrate at a frequency that creates a standing wave in the fuel system. That vibration disrupts the fuel flow to the engines at precisely the moment when they need maximum efficiency to maintain speed. Dr. Chen stared at the diagrams, her mind racing to keep up with the implications. But our sensors would detect fuel flow irregularities. We've monitored every system during the test flights. Your sensors are looking for gross fuel flow problems, Captain Santos replied, adding more detail to her diagrams. This isn't a shortage. It's a disruption in the molecular consistency of the fuel itself. The harmonic vibration creates microbubbles in the fuel lines, tiny air pockets that wouldn't register on flow sensors but that cause catastrophic combustion irregularities when they reach the engine. The explanation was elegant, terrifying, and completely logical. It explained everything, why the failures were so sudden, why they happened at the exact same speed every time, and why the computer simulations couldn't replicate them. The simulators weren't accounting for harmonic resonance because no one had thought to look for it. Colonel Richardson found himself staring at this woman with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. "Captain, how long have you been stationed?" "Here, 6 weeks, sir. I was assigned to logistic support as cover while I observed the Nighthawk program. My actual mission was to identify potential failure modes that might affect similar aircraft in development. And you've been watching U.S. struggle with this problem for 6 weeks without saying anything." Captain Santos's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes that might have been amusement. "Sir, my orders were to observe and report, not to interfere unless specifically asked for my assessment." "You never asked." The simple truth of her statement hit the room like a physical force. For 6 weeks, while they had been pulling their hair out over an impossible problem, the solution had been standing quietly in the corner, pouring coffee and organizing paperwork. She had been watching them fail, not out of cruelty or indifference, but because her mission parameters didn't include unsolicited assistance. Captain Morrison, who had spent the better part of an hour lecturing about the superiority of pilot instinct over computer analysis, looked like he wanted to disappear into his flight suit. "Captain Santos, when you say you've encountered this before, how did you solve it?" "Damping resonators," she replied without hesitation. Small devices installed at specific points along the fuel lines. They absorb the harmonic vibrations before they can build up enough energy to disrupt the fuel consistency. The installation is simple, the cost is minimal, and the effect is immediate. Dr. Chen was frantically taking notes, her engineer's mind already racing ahead to implementation. How small are we talking? And where exactly would they need to be placed? Captain Santos moved to a different section of the whiteboard and began sketching the Nighthawk's fuel system from memory. Her knowledge of the aircraft's internal structure was so detailed and precise that that it was clear she had studied every blueprint, every technical specification, every engineering report. As she drew, she spoke with the calm authority of someone who had lived with these problems for years. "The primary resonator goes here," she said, marking a spot near the main fuel pump. "Secondary units here and here, at the junction points where the fuel lines split to feed the twin engines. The devices themselves are about the size of a hockey puck. Titanium construction with internal dampening chambers filled with a specialized gel that absorbs specific frequency ranges. And this works?" Colonel Richardson asked, though the question was really rhetorical. He could see from her confidence that she wasn't guessing. "The Wraith has been flying stable for 8 months with this modification. The Aurora project was successfully completed after we installed the dampeners. The Blackbird Mark 7 set 3 speed records that are still classified." She capped the marker and turned to face the room. "The technology exists, it's proven, and it can be implemented on the Nighthawk within 72 hours. The transformation in the room was palpable. The defeat and frustration that had hung over the meeting like a dark cloud was evaporating, replaced by something that felt almost like hope. But it was more than just the promise of a technical solution. It was the realization that they had been in the presence of extraordinary competence and had completely failed to recognize it. Colonel Richardson stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Captain Santos. "Captain, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. How many aircraft programs have you saved?" She considered the question for a moment, not with hesitation, but with the careful precision of someone who was used to speaking about classified matters to people with appropriate clearances, programs that would have been canceled without intervention. 7. Programs that would have resulted in pilot fatalities without modification. 12. Programs that achieved their objectives ahead of schedule and under budget after technical consultation. 23. The numbers hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about how the system worked. Here was someone who had quietly been behind some of the most successful classified aircraft programs of the last decade, and she had been invisible to all of them. She was a ghost who fixed machines that officially didn't exist, a problem solver who worked in the shadows while others took credit for the victories. "Captain Santos," Colonel Richardson said, and his voice now carried a formality that bordered on ceremony. "I'm officially requesting your technical consultation on the Nighthawk program. Can you provide us with the specifications for these damping resonators?" "Sir, I have the complete technical package in my quarters. Installation diagrams, parts specifications, testing protocols, and performance data from previous implementations. I can have everything ready for your review within the hour." As the meeting finally broke up, the pilots filed out with a very different energy than they had brought in. The problem that had seemed impossible an hour ago now had a clear, achievable solution. But more than that, they had been given a lesson in humility that none of them would soon forget. They had been shown that competence doesn't always come with fanfare, that expertise doesn't always announce itself, and that sometimes the most important person in the room is the one you don't even notice. 71 hours later, Captain Alina Santos stood in the pre-dawn darkness beside the X-47 Nighthawk, her flight suit bearing the subdued patches of the 42nd Test Squadron. The hangar lights cast long shadows across the concrete floor, and the air was crisp with the bite of desert morning. The sleek aircraft before her looked like something from science fiction, all sharp angles and radar-absorbing surfaces, designed to slice through the atmosphere at speeds that challenged the very laws of physics. The damping resonators had been installed exactly according to her specifications. 3 small titanium devices, each no bigger than a coffee can, now sat at critical points along the Nighthawk's fuel system. They looked almost insignificant, these little pieces of metal and gel that would determine whether a program lived or died. But Captain Santos knew better than anyone that in the world of experimental aviation, success often came down to details so small they were measured in millimeters. Colonel Richardson approached from the hangar office, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand and the weight of command evident in every step. Behind him walked Captain Morrison, who had requested permission to observe the test flight. The events of 3 days ago had shaken something loose in the young pilot's confidence, and he was here to learn rather than to prove anything. "Systems check completed 20 minutes ago," the colonel reported, his voice carrying across the vast hangar. "All green lights across the board. The resonators are functioning within normal parameters. and the flight computer has been updated with the new operational profiles you provided." Captain Santos nodded, her attention focused on the pre-flight checklist she held in her hands. But this wasn't nervous preparation. This was the methodical process of someone who had learned that survival at hypersonic speeds depended on checking everything twice and assuming nothing, weather conditions. She asked. "Perfect. Clear skies, minimal wind, visibility unlimited. The range is cleared for the next 4 hours, and we have chase planes standing by at 2-minute intervals along the flight path." She looked up from her checklist, and for the first time since anyone had known her, Captain Santos smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a slight upturn at the corners of her mouth, but it transformed her face completely. "Then let's go see if this bird can really fly." The next 30 minutes passed in the familiar ritual of aircraft preparation. Santos moved around the Nighthawk with the fluid efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times before, checking control surfaces, inspecting the engines, running her hands along the fuselage as if she could feel the aircraft's readiness. Through her fingertips, the ground crew worked with quiet professionalism, but there was an undercurrent of excitement in their movements. They all knew they were about to witness something special. As Santos climbed into the cockpit, Colonel Richardson activated his headset and established communication with the control tower. "Tower, this is Hangar 7. Nighthawk is ready for Phase 3 testing. Pilot is Captain Santos. Call sign." He paused, realizing he didn't know her call sign. "Ghost," came the calm reply through the comm system. Call sign Ghost. Of course, it was, the colonel thought to himself. Of course, her call sign was Ghost. It was perfect. Someone who moved through the world invisible and unnoticed until the moment when her presence changed everything. With a sound like controlled thunder, even at idle, the aircraft seemed to vibrate with barely contained energy, as if it were eager to break free from the constraints of gravity and show what it was truly capable of. Santos ran through her final checks with methodical precision, her voice calm and professional as she reported each system's status to the control tower. "Tower, this is Ghost. All systems nominal, requesting clearance for takeoff." "Ghost, you are cleared for takeoff. Godspeed, Captain." The Nighthawk rolled out of the hangar like a predator emerging from its lair. Even at taxi speed, it commanded attention, its exotic profile unlike anything else that had ever rolled down a runway. But as Santos guided it toward the active runway, something changed in the aircraft's behavior. It seemed more stable, responsive. The subtle vibrations that had plagued previous flights were gone, absorbed by the small damping devices that now protected the fuel system from the aircraft's own power. The takeoff was flawless. The Nighthawk left the runway with the grace of a bird that had finally remembered how to fly, climbing steadily into the crystal-clear Nevada sky. Santos' voice came through the radio with updates that were both technical and oddly poetic. "Passing through Mach 1, climb rate steady. All systems responding normally." In the control tower, Colonel Richardson and Captain Morrison watched the radar blip that represented the Nighthawk as it accelerated through speed ranges that had previously been impossible. Mach 2 approached like a wall that had stopped every previous attempt. "Approaching Mach 4, Santos reported, her voice as calm as if she were announcing the weather. "Fuel flow steady. Engine parameters within normal ranges, resonators functioning perfectly." Mach 4.2 came and went without incident. The aircraft that had bucked like an angry horse at that speed just days before now flew with the steady confidence of a machine that had finally found its rhythm. But Santos wasn't finished. The real test was yet to come. "Tower, requesting permission to continue acceleration to design maximum." Colonel Richardson felt his pulse spike. Design maximum for the Nighthawk was Mach 6.2, a speed that existed more in theory than in practice. No pilot had ever pushed the aircraft beyond Mach 4.5 and returned to tell about it. "Ghost, are you certain about this?" "We have the data we need to prove the resonators work, sir. With respect, we have data that proves they work at moderate hypersonic speeds. But if this aircraft is going to fulfill its mission requirements, someone needs to find out what it can really do. And that someone might as well be me." 20 minutes later, the Nighthawk was screaming across the desert at Mach 6.1, stable as a rock and responding to Santos' commands like a well-trained horse. The aircraft that had been a hangar queen a week ago was now performing beyond its original specifications. pushing the envelope not with the desperate fury of a machine fighting itself, but with the controlled power of technology that had finally been allowed to reach its potential. When Santos finally brought the Nighthawk back to Edwards, the landing was so smooth it looked routine. But as she taxied back to the hangar, there was a crowd waiting. Word had spread throughout the base that the impossible had happened. The problem child of experimental aviation had been tamed, and it had been done by someone most people had never even noticed. As Captain Santos shut down the engines and climbed out of the cockpit, she was greeted not with cheers or celebration, but with something more valuable: the quiet respect of professionals who recognized exceptional competence. When they saw it, Colonel Richardson was the first to reach her, and his handshake carried the weight of genuine admiration. Captain Santos, that was extraordinary flying. But more than that, it was extraordinary problem-solving. The Air Force owes you a debt of gratitude. She removed her helmet, her dark hair slightly tousled from the flight, and looked around at the assembled crowd of pilots, engineers, and ground crew. Sir, this is what we do. We find problems, we solve them, and we move on to the next challenge. The Nighthawk is ready for operational deployment. Captain Morrison stepped forward, his earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by the kind of humility that comes from being thoroughly outclassed by someone you had underestimated. Captain Santos, I owe you an apology. My behavior in the briefing was unprofessional and inexcusable. I hope you'll accept it. She studied his face for a moment, seeming to weigh his sincerity. Then she nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both acceptance and closure. Apology accepted, Captain. We all have something to learn from each other. The story of the coffee-fetching captain who saved the Nighthawk program became legend within weeks. It spread from Edwards to every test facility and research installation in the country, but like all the best legends, it carried a deeper truth that resonated far beyond the specific details of aircraft and equations. It became a story about the danger of assumptions, about the cost of arrogance, and about the quiet professionals who keep the world running while others take credit for their work. It reminded everyone who heard it that competence doesn't need a spotlight, that expertise doesn't require an audience, and that the most dangerous mistake you can make is dismissing someone based on what you think you see rather than what you know they can do. 6 months later, the X-47 Nighthawk entered operational service as the most successful experimental aircraft program in Air Force history. It came in under budget, ahead of schedule, and with performance specifications that exceeded every original projection. Captain Santos, meanwhile, had quietly moved on to her next assignment. Another impossible problem on another classified program, where her particular combination of brilliance and invisibility was desperately needed, but her legacy lived on in every briefing room, every hangar, and every flight line where young pilots learned their trade. Her story became a reminder that true professionalism is measured not by how much attention you demand, but by how effectively you solve the problems that others can't. It taught a new generation that the most important contributions often come from the most unexpected sources, and that respect is something that can only be earned through competence, dedication, and the quiet courage to do what needs to be done. For more stories about quiet heroes whose competence changed everything, stories about the unsung professionals who solve impossible problems while others take the credit, subscribe to Hidden Sparks.